How many are you expecting to attend this webinar today? How many people will be joining us on this webinar?
Sangeeta, are you there? Ray is asking a question.
One second, I was just trying to unmute myself. So Ray, we have members from the Economic Times India Leadership Council expecting around 70 members to be joining. And
Right.
there are a few delegates also joining us from other parts of the country. In total, should be expecting around 200 plus people joining in.
Good. The requests for webinars like this are just pouring into my desk from all over the world.
Everybody seems to be worried about business continuity.
Yeah, everybody's trying to just find the tools with which to think about what's going on.
Yes.
And are most of the people who are joining us in their own homes, or are some of them in the office?
I think most people are working from their homes.
Yeah. Interestingly, Germany has decided to make it a right for people who are working at home to be able to work from home in the future.
Yes, I believe certain corporates are looking at the benefits of productivity and work from home and probably deciding. In fact, I think one of the largest discussions we're having is on the part of the Indian IT services industry, who are had to sort of manage H-1B visas for the last couple of years, and they had already devised a strategy based on cloud, and then working on the cloud from different locations. So probably this is going to sort of accelerate policy towards corporate governance policy towards that effect.
Yeah.
Hi Ray,
Yes.
I've just sent you something on chat. Do you think that that works?
Do I think what works?
I've sent you something on chat, on a private chat.
Okay, I haven't got it on the screen at the moment.
Okay.
Aniban, we'll wait for 1 more minute and then we'll start. 3:30.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Good to go, Sangeeta? Sangeeta, we good to go? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the focused webinar on business after COVID-19. Thank you for joining from your homes. Welcome delegates, ILC members. The webinar is going to be sort of hosted by us, and sort of the speaker is Ray Hammond. So, as the zoonotic coronavirus sort of runs amok, globally, and with more than 3 million people affected, we are living through a major inflection point in history. This means that when normal life resumes, the future won't look or feel much like the normal we've been used to. Social and economic life will eventually recover, and in time will thrive again. But many things by then will have changed forever. We will be living and working in a new landscape. It is too soon to know the details of these changes and how far-reaching they will be. Likely candidates for change include a massive permanent shift to remote online working, major changes to retail delivery, new ways of delivering education, and remote methods of healthcare delivery. There will be a complete rethinking when it comes to globalization, supply chains, with much manufacturing being reshored, and a massive increase in robot automation investment and AI deployment. It is likely that the West will seek to reduce its reliance on overseas labor and forces. But the fundamentals of business will have not changed. People will still need food, energy, water, transportation, healthcare, education, news, banking, real estate, and entertainment. But it is not clear how these will be delivered. As Lenin had observed in 1919, that there are decades when nothing happened, and there are weeks when decades happen. With this, I would like to introduce to you today's speaker, Dr. Ray Hammond, who is a British author, a futurist, and a UN Global Medal winner. Ray Hammond is Europe's most experienced and most widely published futurist. For over 35 years, he's been writing and speaking about the trends that will shape the future. His long record of accurate foresight is unique in Europe, and he is now living in the technological future he first described 30 years ago. In 2010, former President Mikhail Gorbachev presented Ray with a UN Gold Medal for services to futurology. Ray is also a successful and a proven business leader and a serial entrepreneur who has hands-on experience of creating and selling profitable businesses. Today, Ray is the author of 14 books about the future, a body of work which he began in 1980 and which stands as a testament to the long-term accuracy and reliability of his foresight. His 1984 publication, The Online Handbook, was the world's first book to identify overwhelming importance of the internet and to identify search as the key driving force of all future online advertising and digital commerce. The key takeaway from his sessions would include the COVID-19 pandemic, the inflection point that the COVID-19 pandemic is creating. The new normal will not look or feel like the new normal we have been used to. Business delivery methods changing in many sectors, and so on and so forth. Before I hand it over to Ray, I would like to request all the members of IIC and other delegates attending to only post your questions on the message board, which we will take up on, after Ray has finished speaking. And please write your name and the question and your designation before you post it on the message board. Over to you, Ray.
Thank you, and hello, everybody. This pandemic is indeed a turning point in world history. It's something that seems as if we are living in science fiction. And it's something that I frankly never expected to do in my life, and I doubt whether you expected to do so in your life. And social and economic life will eventually recover. And I don't think we'll really see what that's going to look like for at least 10 years. And most people want to know from a business perspective, well, how soon can I get back to doing what I was doing? And the answer is, for most people, it won't be the same. And that actually means that what you have been doing, which probably, and I hope has been successful, may need to be changed. Now, as I say, it's too soon to know the details of the new landscape that's going to emerge. What we do know is that everybody is going to be a lot more conscious about pandemics, about viruses, about transmissible diseases, and that's going to affect consumer psychology and business-to-business psychology, and that will last a very long time, and perhaps it's a shift forever. Now, in the introduction you heard that I think there's going to be a profound shift to online working, because so many of us are being forced to work from home that a lot of people will want to continue to do so if their work allows when this pandemic has passed. And in fact, in Germany, they are considering giving certain employees the right to work from home so that employers can't make them attend offices. And of course, if this is to happen, and I think it probably will, it means huge changes in commuting time. It means huge changes in air pollution, as far fewer people are using cars to go to and from work. I think it also means that those of us who find it easy to get motivated at home will be thanking and blessing this for actually making that a reality. But other people, I think, don't find it so easy to work from home. It's not just that there are distractions of the children or, something else happening. It's that the motivation to work often comes from being with other people. Now, what I do think is going to happen is that I think every organisation realises that perhaps once a week, people in teams have to get together physically. They have to meet, they have to gossip, they have to exchange information, because it's in that space that really creative things happen. And I don't think we are in the future going to be sitting at home doing our work and never meeting our colleagues. I think we will be meeting our colleagues at least once a week. And I think every business will realise that that's a very important part of making home working actually work. In education, there's going to be a profound shift, because although many children now, just at the moment, are being homeschooled, for children under 13 or 14, that simply doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is that primary younger education needs children to build a relationship with a professionally trained teacher and to experience the socialization which comes from being with their peer groups. Basically, they learn how to behave with each other. And we also need, of course, the childcare facilities that schools bring, especially for children under 14 or 15, because many of us need to work, and we really can't do that if we're looking after children. And I think we're also going to see, and I will be touching on this in more detail later on in this webinar, I think we're going to see some major changes to the way healthcare is delivered. And basically, I think we've seen a compression, an acceleration of global IT and communication and digital skills learning. I mean, I thought that it would be another 10 to 15 years before everybody was using digital technology. But that seems to have happened in just a couple of months. Even very elderly people, people who are technophobes, people who are Luddites, are being forced, basically, to use technology to order their shopping, to consult with their doctor, and so on. And this means that the sort of progress we've achieved in online education is kind of a decade's worth in a few weeks. Another factor I think is going to change in the new landscape is we're going to find nations and companies rethinking globalization and their supply chains. This has frightened governments as much as it's frightened individual people. And I'm not so sure that the long distance supply chain is likely to survive for mission critical material. I think we're going to see, in particular, medical supply chains being reduced. And I think we're going to see the manufacture of pharmaceuticals and the active ingredients which go into pharmaceuticals actually repatriated. I mean, today, a country like the USA or like France or like Australia will be buying components for its healthcare system from all over the world. But the problem is, when travel becomes difficult, when there's a pandemic, some of those critical materials simply don't become available. And that is not okay. We've been on this path now for perhaps 30 years of globalization. And we've realized that it's fine for some things, but we have got it wrong when it comes to matters of priority. I also think we are going to reshore or repatriate vaccine production for obvious reasons. I mean, at the moment in the UK, for example, we do not have the facilities to make a vaccine. We will have to ask other people to do it for us until we can build our own facilities. And what we know is every nation wants to be able to produce its own vaccine. And I think we're going to see a massive increase in acceleration in the take-up of robots, automation, and AI development, for the simple reason that robots and AI systems cannot catch COVID-19. or any other sort of viruses. Yes, I know they go wrong. Yes, I know they have bugs. I know they have problems, but they really are a lot more resilient than humans in some situations. Now, call centers, as you know, are a very large part of Indian industry. And with this wretched virus, we're seeing people having to distance themselves socially or work from home, but that isn't always possible. And what this means is that we are going to see a rapid investment and a rapid increase in AI development. And this will mean some humans being replaced from call centers. Because as you will realize, typically an AI chatbot will just handle the first and fairly easy part of an interaction with customers, with human customers. And then when it becomes complex, it gets handed off to a human. But those chatbots, those AI bots, can actually remove a lot of jobs in call centers. In fact, you quoted this in the introduction, but I think it's worth quoting again. The last time I used this quote was in 2008, at the time of a financial crisis. And in 1919, Lenin was musing on the Russian Revolution that introduced communism to Russia. And he observed that sometimes nothing happens, and then at other times it seems as if everything happens when decades happen. Well, we are in that situation now. Now let's talk about what post-pandemic landscapes may look like. We will not be able to get back to any sort of normal life, any sort, until we have an effective vaccine which is distributed around the world. And I think that is autumn of 2021. So we've got about 18 months to go. Now, you may have read in the papers that in Oxford, in the UK, they think they may have a working vaccine by this September. Well, I hope that's true. But even if it does work, it will still have to be tested for a period of months to make sure that the vaccine doesn't cause other problems, like give you cancer. And then it will have to be produced in bulk and distributed. Another factor which is very important is there will not be just one vaccine. There will probably be 20. And the reason is that vaccines will be needed for different strains of the virus and for different people. Children will need a different type of vaccine to elderly people. We may find that different racial groups need different vaccines. You may even find that different sexes need different vaccines. So we are going to have a suite of vaccines. And of course, being scientists, researchers say, but we don't actually know whether we will ever find an effective vaccine. Well, I think they're right from a purely scientific point of view, but in practical terms, I'm confident we will. And the reason I'm confident is that we know enough about the coronavirus family to know that we can actually take it down. And I think that by October of next year, we'll begin to actually emerge back into normal life. I think in the short term, in the 6 months to 2 years, we'll all be living in some sort of hybrid social distancing economy. And that's going to be very difficult for some businesses, think of restaurants or think of bars, where people are normally very close together. Now, one thing I wanted to mention, particularly because I'm talking to India, is that cash is a major problem because it is a carrier of the virus, or of any virus. And 50% of the transactions in India today are cash. Well, there needs to be a very rapid transfer to contactless and electronic payments. The technology exists, but the government will have to promote it and will have to get it into the country. because as long as cash is still circulating, it is a carrier of the virus. Another thing that is happening, and this depends nation to nation, it isn't global, is that some key industries and services, because they've been so badly affected by this outbreak, this pandemic, will actually be taken into public ownership. Nationalisation, in other words. And in the UK, it includes railways. They have been, having been private for 25 years, they're now actually being renationalised. Airlines, shipping, steelmaking, car manufacture, all of these industries are likely to see, in some nations, not all, a degree of state investment. And what this means is that even if the politics of government do not change, it is actually a massive shift leftwards, because we're seeing states involved in social and economic life in ways that they haven't been since the war, since World War II, or since, perhaps I should say, the financial crash of 2008. Now, the question is this going to change how companies think? Is this going to change how companies manage their future balance sheets? Because are they actually going to now try to build in resilience against another outbreak of a pandemic? Or will, or will they stay with their lean models? Will they move to from a just-in-time to a just-in-case model? Now, one of the things that I've been studying the future and talking about it for 40 years. And every so often people have asked me about so-called black swan events. And I'm sure you all know what black swan events are. It's the equivalent of seeing a black swan rather than a white swan, which is such a rare thing, you may only see it once in your lifetime. And I've always said about black swan events, I've said the problem with that is that by their very nature, they cannot be predicted. And when one happens, you don't know what it is. For example, a black swan event may not just be a pandemic, it could be a nuclear war. It could be an asteroid hurtling towards the Earth. It could be massive and overwhelming climate change. Although I have to say, to be fair, that climate change cannot be considered a black swan event because we know it's coming. So in the light of this, will companies continue to actually operate with minimal liquidity, with maximum borrowings, which in the last 10 years, global interest rates have been so long that companies have borrowed and borrowed and borrowed. And they've been actually very fragile as a result. And will governments also continue to rely on global markets to address local crises? And I think I've indicated earlier that, in my opinion, I actually don't think they will. I don't think we're going to see an end to globalization, but I think we're going to see a rethinking of it so that those items that are critical are not at a 6,000 or 12,000 mile distance. Now, globally, governments have actually put $10.6 trillion worth of economic stimulus in. And just to give you an idea, that's 8 times larger in real terms than the amount of money poured into Europe after the Second World War to rebuild it. I mean, it is actually an enormous amount of money. And in India, as you will know, the economic stimulus stands at about $40 billion. Just to give you a real bit of thinking about this, the rich world may end up taking trillions and trillions of public debt, up to as much as 122% of world GDP. This is the worst economic shock since World War II, there's no doubt about it. We've got Indian unemployment at 23% currently. It's probably going to go higher. I mean, just take a look at, for example, the world famous Indian wedding market in the spring. I mean, so many people in India, for obvious reasons, like to get married in the spring. And that is a $57 billion hit this spring, according to KPMG. I mean, that is absolutely enormous. And the result is very, very grim. In the UK, there was an event in 1709, and now I don't remember it, when there was a terrible winter. It was called the Great Frost. And the result of this terrible, terrible winter was massive famine. Millions died. And in fact, UK forecasts are saying that it's going to be that bad in the UK. And at the moment, a huge number of businesses have closed or are closing, but I'm afraid that's only the beginning of the failures. This is something unprecedented. Friends of mine are losing their businesses. Governments are trying to help. They're making emergency loans and direct payments to people who are furloughed or laid off. And this is something basically that we have to accept. And part of this webinar, I hope, is to promote the acceptance of the situation. And an investor called Warren Buffett made a remark during the financial crisis of 2008, is that only when the tide goes out do you discover who's been swimming naked. And of course, what that means is so many businesses have been operating on the thinnest margins with huge borrowings. And perhaps we're discovering now that that model is unsustainable. But I've been trying to think about ways to help, positive things. What I think is needed in many nations is an urgent revision to bankruptcy legislation that emulates the USA's Chapter 11. As I'm sure you know, Chapter 11 allows insolvent American businesses to get some protection from their creditors, while the directors of the business try to restructure it. And the aim of Chapter 11 is really to prevent businesses with strong potential from being bankrupted prematurely. Now, this does mean, of course, that the courts must decide that the existing directors are not crooks. They must decide that the company has got potential. But basically, it allows time for a company to be redesigned, for a new business model to be written and followed, so that it can return to profit, and then it can repay the creditors who were waiting. Now, thankfully, India, France, and Germany are examples of nations which have recently updated their bankruptcy legislation, and there is some degree of Chapter 11 in there. So well done, India, but the UK has got a very poor legislation about bankruptcy. And I'm pleased to say that yesterday, the UK business minister, in an attempt to patch this up, has announced a moratorium for bankrupt companies. And what that moratorium is protection from creditors, rather like Chapter 11, so that companies can actually reorganize and attempt to get through this difficult period. But we do need proper legislation, not just a minister's moratorium, to actually help companies all over the world to actually get through what is an artificial slump. It doesn't mean there was anything profoundly wrong with their business. It means that this black swan event has arrived and has caused havoc temporarily. Now, one thing I do want to say is that I do not think this unheralded, unprecedented event is an existential threat to our forms of social democracy, of capitalist democracy. I know that some people have said, well, this is it. This is the moment when we descend into anarchy. This is the moment it becomes Mad Max or apocalypse. I don't think so. I think actually what will happen is we're going to resume flying, driving, and all sorts of normal commercial activity once we can. But I don't think it's going to change the way we govern ourselves. I think that voters and investors may demand that capitalism becomes more stakeholder oriented, which means that large businesses in particular are aware of their responsibilities to the community in which they operate. They're aware of the responsibilities to the people around their business in the local area, not just to investors, but to their employees who are also stakeholders, as are their customers. And when this is all over, companies might be judged by how did they behave during the pandemic, during the war, as it were? How did they treat their suppliers and customers? And, for example, who shared and who hoarded valuable commodities? And I think that this is going to lead to a more responsible form of capitalism. I don't think we're going to become post-capitalist utopias. It doesn't exist, because I think we've learned over the last century that there is no better model than social democratic capitalism. And I think that forms of collectivism like communism and control by central government have been tried repeatedly, and they've all failed. We're not going there, I don't think. Now let's have a look at the new opportunities and new rules, which I think are actually going to emerge. Business fundamentals, as you said, Sangeeta, are not going to change. Many business sectors will thrive in the post-pandemic world. We all need food and water. We all need shelter, property. We all need energy. We all need healthcare. We all need clothing. We need a way to earn a living. We need some basic education, and that's up to perhaps 11 or 12 years old, basic education. We need some limited forms of transport, and all of those categories are absolute needs. And anything after that is really a menu of wishes. Now, every crisis brings opportunities, and there's plenty of money, believe it or not, in the global financial systems. Unlike 2008, the banks have got reasonable amounts of capital. And the world is awash with excess savings. And the reason for that is that interest rates have been so low. People have been saving money in and attempting to invest it. This means that those with the money or the credit rating can snap up distressed corporate bargains and refinance and reinvigorate them. But the one thing I would say is this: for any investors who are thinking that this is the ideal time to buy up companies that have gone out of business, is that you want to be sure you don't buy the old business model as well. Because one of the reasons it's gone out of business may not be just this pandemic, but in fact the business was run and it was quite fragile in the model it was using. I think there's going to be new opportunities in remote working tools. Hello? Someone was speaking to me. No, I'll continue. I think there's going to be new opportunities in developing remote working tools and technologies. Look at this Zoom technology. Well, there's many, many more things that are needed like this that do different things, that do specific items that are important. I think in medicine, there's going to be most profound opportunities, because as we suddenly have moved to take up telemedicine and virtual health, I think we're going to see distributed hospitals, and we need the monitors, we need the devices, we need all of the stuff that makes digital medicine work. I think that education for the 14 upwards group is going to move online, not entirely, but partly. So I think there's real opportunity in educational reorganization. I think that's also true for retail, because people in this pandemic have been staying at home, shopping online, and I think there are great opportunities to deliver warehousing, smart warehousing, fulfillment and logistics. And then of course we come back to robotics and AI. I think that we must accept that although it's not going to happen immediately, people will return to travel. I'll be dealing with that in a moment. Restaurants, concerts, sports, but they may be slow to do so. And the reason is that people are very resistant to the idea of exposing themselves to disease. And that is something that really is important. These reasons for business not emerging very quickly, obviously, in the wake of this pandemic, you have unemployment and lack of money, a lack of confidence in short and long-term resilience of the economy. And of course, I would say, in general, there's an increased understanding of the link between human activity and environmental damage. I think it is astonishing to see the world, nature, coming back so rapidly, the air cleaning so quickly, purifying so quickly as we stop our normal activities. And I hope, perhaps it's a wish on my part, I'd like to think that societies will actually take from this an understanding that it is our activities which pollute this planet. And we need to go about our activities in a far cleaner way. And I'm hoping that that, for example, might be a message that comes out of this. I think there are some areas which might be slower than others to recover. I think people for long distance jet travel or leisure cruising, they might not like the idea of being trapped in confined spaces with many others. I think that's a worry. And I think that at first, some people may avoid foreign travel and choose to use video conferencing for business meetings. And they even take their vacations in their home nations. Let's talk about sectors and their resilience. Now, what we've noticed, of course, is the fundamental importance of food. And what we have learned in the UK, and it may not be true for India, is that we have not been growing enough or rearing enough cattle in our own nation. We've been importing. And of course, what that means at a time like this is that travel restrictions mean that import chains break down. I think we can certainly expect to see in nations like the UK an increase in customer preference for homegrown and local produce. I mean, certainly in our household, we've always had the attitude of trying to buy locally, trying to buy products that are produced locally. I think this will be an idea which spreads. And I think that it also may be...
I am sorry, you are not allowed to use conference service for 1 or less participants.
I'm getting an interruption. Did you hear that?
We did, Ray. I think you can continue.
Shall I just go on?
Yeah, please.
Okay. I think we may also see an opportunity for building new forms of agriculture. We may see some more vertical farming being developed. And I think we may see some more lab-grown meat and alternatives to meat, which I welcome from the point of view of climate change, of course. I think we're going to see online food and beverage shopping that has accelerated to the point of being unavailable in the UK. I think we're going to see that push forward by 10 years. I think that is a massive acceleration. And I think in this country, and of course I understand that you have known it forever in India, is the value of corner shops and convenience stores has been rediscovered here. And I think this trend may last. And I think that small stores in the UK, they've just started to deliver, of course. And they're partnering with companies like Deliveroo and Zomato and Swiggy and Uber Eats, because the convenience at the time of pandemic of having food delivered, the safety of it is actually something I think is going to stick. And we have seen a rapid growth of dark kitchens. These are kitchens which are not attached to restaurants. They're industrial kitchens, probably sited on an industrial estate in containers and so on. They produce any sort of food, and they are entirely kitchens for delivery. And I think these are going to be central. And in fact, during this hybrid social distancing period, delivery, home deliveries, may be the way that restaurants actually are able to operate. Let's have a look at the utilities sector. Not a lot of change here, except that I think, as we are discovering, that broadband, 5G and so on is so important to life, I think it will be regarded as a right, the sort of right we have to water or electricity. And I think the public will get legal rights to these services. Energy, gas, electricity and oil will still be needed, although I do think that governments will probably re-examine supply chains. Water, waste, sewage, drainage, all needed, so not a lot of change there. In healthcare, there will be huge amounts of change. The pandemic crisis revealed many failings in the national health and social care services. Now, I do not know if that is the view of Indian society. I do know that the health service in India is relatively undeveloped compared, for example, to the UK or Germany's. But in the UK, I have to say that society as a whole has been completely and absolutely demanding that the government give whatever it needs to the health and social care sectors. And I believe that after this, I think the governments will attempt to completely redesign the way healthcare is funded and administered. And in our society, many societies, in the USA, in Australia, the voters have made it clear to governments that actually getting good healthcare with equal access to all, they care more about that than they do about taxation or the standards of living. And in fact, I think voters may now vote to fund care services properly, nursing homes for the old people, which have not been funded well in many sectors. I mean, one of the biggest problems around the world, of course, is the American healthcare system. We have a dreadful system there, which is primarily private, but with some provision for welfare patients. And if you lose your job in America today, you often lose your health insurance almost immediately. And this means that for the 36 million people who've just lost their jobs in the USA, they've also got to worry about not having any money and not having any healthcare. This is something that I'm not sure whether the USA will be able to sort it out. They've been trying to forever, but whether or not they will, I don't know. Now, I think the shift, I have been writing and thinking about delivering healthcare digitally for a long time. And I think the course has been advanced by more than a decade in just a few months. And there's millions of senior citizens to be forced to use it. I mean, in other words, you can't see a doctor in the UK, you have to consult on the phone, or more likely on a tablet or on a smartphone. And this has really forced elderly people to use technology when they've been reluctant to do so before. And as a result of that, I think there's going to be a rapid rollout of telehealth and virtual healthcare delivery. And I think we're going to see a lot more usage of monitors like blood pressure, of blood oxygen level, of heart rate, of temperature and so on, which feeds back to our doctors. So that as our doctors are looking on their screen at an image of us as we describe our health, they've also got readouts for most of our vital signs. And this means that remote telehealth works extremely well. Now, I think there's going to be a huge investment in real-time data collection from these monitors, and of course the use of AI analysis of the data that comes back. And that data will be of great use in designing pharmaceuticals, in designing treatments, and actually allowing the medical sector to get an idea of distributed treatment in the community. Let's take a look at banking and financial services. I think the central banks, such as the Fed in America, the European Central Bank, the Reserve Bank of India, have all responded extremely well. I think this has been an absolutely wonderful response they have made. And this time round, major commercial banks are much better capitalized than they were in 2008. But those same banks, the big commercial banks, will be judged on how well they react to society's needs. And their behaviour will be compared to how they behaved in 2008. And I have to say that so far, many of them have stopped their dividends and cancelled their big bonuses for their star bankers, which I think is probably encouraging. Now, the use of financial technology, fintech, has been hugely accelerated by the pandemic. I mean, everybody wants to use contactless payments, yes? So we've seen a giant uptake. There's been a 72% rise in the use of fintech apps in Europe, a strong increase in Asia, in the Middle East. I think that cash will disappear now and online payments will proliferate. And the long-term legacy of this virus will be an increasingly digital and online society. I do think that property is going to suffer as a result of the recession which follows the pandemic. And I think that in some cities, especially like London and New York and Paris, San Francisco, we've seen mid-prime property, that's property with a value of between $1 million and $8 or $10 million, has been overvalued. And I think they're going to be hardest hit. I think they may lose as much as 20 or 30% of the value. And of course, rental values, these properties, is also going to fall. Property sales have stopped, you know that, and they will go on being stalled while people get used to this new world of the recession. Owners and landlords have to adjust their expectations, and the property market will, of course, eventually pick up, but it might take 5 years, could even take 10. And then, of course, there's commercial property. And we've got the sort of drop in value of general retail property. That's the non-essential sales, like shopping malls, retail parks, fashion outlets. If you like, discretionary retail, shopping for things you don't need, but might just like. So I think the drop in the value of general retail property will accelerate. And I think that there's going to be some reduction in the value of office space. Because if, for example, companies discover that their productivity has been fine during the lockdown, then I think they're going to reduce the office space. They're not going to close office buildings. I think what they'll do is they'll reduce the square footage or square meterage they want. And they will still keep the communal areas so that people who work from home can come in once or twice a week to meet with their teams and peers and colleagues to discuss projects, etc. And I think that online procurement and retail shopping will continue to grow rapidly. And that means that more smarter warehousing will be in demand. So I'll see an increase in property value for warehousing. But I think that general commercial property, the sort that banks occupy or restaurants or real estate offices, are likely to suffer further dramatic increases in value because of the move online. And then we come to education. I've mentioned that primary education will continue in school. Secondary education will switch to a hybrid online version.
I am sorry. You are not allowed to use conference service for 1 or less participants.
I'm sorry, I had another interruption from the software.
I would request all members and viewers watching the conference, please not to try to unmute your speaker as of now when Ray is presenting. We will give you time after Ray's presentation to ask questions in the message board, and we'll try to answer as many of them. Ray, you can continue. Sorry for the inconvenience.
Okay, I'm not quite sure what happened, but let me just get back to where I was. And I think that colleges and universities are going to shift even more online. Now, one of the things that has happened is that universities are worrying now about whether overseas students will return. In the UK, we have had many students from China, from India, from Hong Kong, from Singapore, from Vietnam for the last 20 years. I think a lot of those students are reconsidering whether or not they want to travel to attend a university or college on the other side of the world. That may be just a short-term thing for a year or two, or it may actually be much longer. So I think that one of the main worries is that how will universities fund themselves when they have expanded to the point of being able to accommodate all of these overseas students? Certainly in the UK, they are very, very worried indeed. I think there's going to be entirely new types of college courses. As you will know, MIT has been offering online courses for at least 12 or 15 years. And I think that fee-paying schools, especially those with overseas students again, are cutting their rates dramatically in an attempt to try and lure back the lost students. Now, of course, leisure and hospitality has been very badly hit indeed. Almost as the pandemic started, Airbnb cancelled 90% of the bookings, and the short-term lettings market collapsed. The hotels and the bars, clubs, cafes and restaurants were all closed. And the problem is that many will not return when the lockdown is lifted. And sadly, this sector will be the last to be unlocked, because you realise that social distancing rather spoils the whole point of the crowded bar or the nightclub or the busy restaurant. You don't get the atmosphere, you don't get the buzz when people have to sit 2 or 3 meters apart when your waiter arrives with a mask and gloves on to serve you. And for example, in restaurants during this period, every time a customer uses the bathroom, it has to be disinfected. I mean, it's a very, very difficult way of operation. I think that when restrictions are lifted, initial demand in this area is likely to be depressed. I'm not sure the public want to rush back to crowded bars. And then if I was a restaurateur today, do I want to put my money and my time into a business which is so fragile when something like this occurs? And I think as a result, the investor confidence in this sector will be very low for some years. I think that road travel is going to return very quickly, and that is because it is easy to be socially distant inside a vehicle. But I think traffic volumes may be slightly lower, especially if commuters are able to work from home. I think railway passengers will resume quickly, but once again, there's that issue of social distancing. At first, it may be that railway trains can only take 50% of their existing capacity. And having been to India on many occasions and seen the railways in India, you know that I smile when I talk about social distancing on railways. But it may be necessary to stop this pandemic. And I think that short-haul air passengers will return quickly. I think some low fares will be offered at first, but the problem is fares have got to rise because the airlines have got to remove the middle seat or tape them off. And I think that is going to be an extremely difficult one to deal with. And I think there's got to be new procedures for checking, for security and boarding. I mean, if you must keep people 2 meters apart, how long will it take to go through immigration? Or how long will it take to go through security, to have your bags searched, to have, you know, it is extremely difficult. And then as you're boarding the plane, as you go down the tube or as you walk across the tarmac, if you've got to stay 2 meters apart, that means that every person getting on the plane must have found his or her seat before you're allowed to board. So I think the difficulties are enormous. And I think that even short haul will not return that quickly. And I think long haul air travel will be very slow to return. And I don't think we're likely to see the sort of volumes we've seen until this pandemic for at least 5 or 10 years. Smaller, more local forms of travel, like ferry travel, will resume, but that will also be at reduced volumes. I think more vacations will be taken in home nations. I think international vacations and tourism will be very reduced for the next 5 years. And I have to say that the international cruising market may never recover, because at the beginning of this pandemic, we saw those terrible scenes of cruise ships where there are hundreds of coronavirus victims on board, and these poor ships were trying to find somewhere to dock, trying to find a port that would accept them. And of course, they were just being forced back out to sea as the disease kept spreading. And I actually think that travel passengers for the cruising market may not want to get back onto those sort of cruise liners. So think of them as giant petri dishes in which diseases are just fermenting and spreading. But I do think that river cruises may grow in popularity because that is very short distance between stops. And of course, it's far, far less dense, a few hundred people. Let's talk about your sector. The circulation of physical newspapers has declined dramatically during COVID-19. Now, you will know that. The main problem, I think, in India is delivery, is actually getting it out to the people who want to read the paper. Elsewhere, people have not gone out to buy papers, and the physical newspaper circulations have declined dramatically. Now, in India, it seems to me that that's very likely to return rapidly. And I think you're likely to see circulations recover quickly because you're a unique market, as you know. But of course, because of the pandemic and because of the recession, advertising revenues in print media and TV have suffered a very steep decline. For example, it's over 50% in Europe. And what advertising there is has moved online. Now, what I would say is that for television, there is increased viewing figures. People want to see the news, they want to see what's going on. And of course, everybody wants to stream their Netflix or their Amazon, Disney, whatever. There's a huge growth for the younger people in content that's generated by the users, like YouTube and TikTok and so on. But overall, the advertising spend in conventional TV and newspapers will be greatly reduced during the recession. TV itself desperately needs sports events to resume. But the future for sports events is not great because a big part of sporting events is the crowd element, the feeling. I think that some events, for example, Formula One, will resume in locked doors, in locked stadia. I think that it will be empty. Nobody will be there apart from the athletes, apart from the participants. I think there's a great future for conventional TV in news, live events, sports concerts and so on. But I don't think we're going to see a return to normal for concerts, sporting events and so on till after we've got those vaccines. Esports, of course, virtual horse racing is proving popular, but cinema attendance can't resume fully until the vaccines are in widespread use. Now, I'm almost at the end of my presentation, not quite, almost. Manufacturing and engineering is going to be reorganized. We've had a terrible problem in the UK. I know there's one in the USA of finding breathing machines, ventilators for those who are sick with COVID-19. We've had to set up new manufacturing plants to do that. And I think many things will be reshored, repatriated, including medical equipment, manufacture, communications equipment. Call centers will be repatriated. I think there will actually be all sorts of changes to pharmaceutical manufacture, and I think active ingredient manufacture. And I think that as we'll see deglobalization occurring, huge investments, and I've said twice before, will be made in AI and robotics to replace the cheap labor that was used overseas in manufacturing operations. Perhaps the most worrying sector is retail. Discretionary retail that I've talked about earlier is already suffering. Online shift has exacerbated the trend. Customers during this hybrid period may not be able to try clothes on in shops. Well, that rather alters the retail experience. And I think discretionary retail will have to become increasingly
I am
needed.
sorry. You are not allowed to use conference service for 1 or less participants.
Can you hear me?
We can. Ray, you can continue.
You can? Okay, look, I'm going to wrap up by saying, essentially, in whatever sector you work, every CEO must ask, is our business model fit for purpose? I think that is the question that must be in front of us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray, so much for that wonderful insights from the presentation that you just shared with the audience. Now we are taking in questions from the audience. The first question I would like to pose to you, Ray, is from Mr. Anish Sri Krishna, who is the CEO of Times Pro, and he asks you that if world economies are going to borrow up to 120% of GDP during this pandemic, what kind of deficit financing is going to be needed, and how will governments look to finance this kind of massive deficit?
Firstly, I'm very optimistic about the increased productivity we're going to see through AI and robotics in the next 15 years. I don't think there's any doubt that it will take us decades to pay off the public debt we are incurring now. Decades, rather like the debts after World War II. But I think the one thing we have got that they did not have in the 50s and 60s is robotics and AI. Both of these fields, disciplines, have been conspicuously pregnant in the last few years, and I know that they are about to deliver. This has consequences for human workers, which is another subject, but they will prove very productive. And I believe that the new wealth generated by robots and by AI systems will help to pay down the huge debts the world is incurring.
The second question, Ray, comes from Prashant Pandey from Right Management. He is asking you that, what is your view on the impact that this pandemic will have on global poverty and hence social unrest in different economies? Are we heading towards some serious law and order problems?
I'm sorry, Anaban, I missed a little bit of that. What impact will it have on global what?
Poverty and,
Formative?
Poverty.
Poverty, okay. Well, it will have a very severe impact. The pandemic is cruelest to the poorest. And as the world attempts to get past this point and rebuild itself, there has to be less money available for aid. There has to be less money available to help the poor. But yet at the same time, we know that we have to help. So it will be a very delicate balancing act. But what I do know is that it's going to be a difficult time for the poorest. And I think there's an opportunity now for governments in the rich world to stop multinationals, the big multinational corporations, avoiding their taxes. Now, we have been in Europe, for example, certainly in the USA, we have been lax in forcing the likes of Apple and Intel and Facebook and so on. We've been very lax, Alibaba, we've been very lax in forcing them to pay national taxes. We have allowed large corporations to make significant profits in Germany, for example, or in the UK, or in another country, and then to direct those profits to a low tax or no tax regime. I think now is the time for that to end. And I think the taxation raised, which at the moment is sitting in corporate accounts in their trillions of dollars, I think we have to put that to work to help rebuild our nations and to help the poor. I think there's another element attached to this, and that is that over the last 10 years, private equity has bought up companies, has then laden them with borrowings, with huge amounts of debts, has taken the money received, and the private equity people and the management have paid themselves handsome bonuses and dividends. And then, of course, when something like this pandemic strikes, these heavily over-leveraged companies ask governments for bailouts. Well, I think that has to stop. And I believe that there is enough money in the system as a whole to actually solve the problems presented by the pandemic. But we have to change the way we behave.
Another follow-up questions we're getting from a lot of members is that, they asked you first about poverty, but also the pandemic has sort of led to social unrest and law and order situations in many parts of the world. How do you think that will be sort of perceived or met by the government, and what will be the economic impact of those sort of unrest, in the future?
Well, we have seen stirrings of unrest in Hong Kong. We've seen it in certain states in the United States. We've seen a little bit in France, in Paris, and it is clear that societies tend to react violently sometimes when big things go wrong like this. But I think that, importantly, there is no real risk to law and order, because I think the police and the military in all nations understand that what has happened here is a natural catastrophe. It isn't a result of wicked governance. It isn't a result of a dictator introducing this to damage his or her people. So I actually don't think that the likelihood of large-scale social unrest is a significant risk. It may happen in different places at different times, but I do not think we'll find the world rearing up. I think we will together get this under control.
Another question we have from one of the members is from Mukesh Malhotra, who's from Solvay. He's asking you, reshoring to become self-reliant and perhaps protectionism by all economies, including emerging economies, which are also big and growing markets. And in context to that, what do you think will be the future of globalization?
I think there is a risk that nations will turn inwards after this. We've seen a trend towards nationalism in the last few years with Donald Trump and Bolsonaro and with Hungary and so on. We've seen this trend, this populist trend. And I think that that may continue, that nationalist bit. But I do not think we're going to give up globalization. I do not think, because we've all gained so much from it. I believe that globalization since 1995 has done more good for the world than all of the overseas aid that has been offered by the rich world to the developing world since the Second World War. I think nearly 1 billion people have been lifted out of absolute poverty in East Asia. I think it has really, really, really been wonderful. And globalization has brought great benefits to the rich nations as well. And I don't think that's going to stop, but I think it is going to be considered carefully. And I think we're going to choose which parts we take and which parts we don't.
There are a couple of members who are also asking about, do you have any specific advice for startups or MSMEs during this pandemic period? Because MSMEs form one of the most...
Conference is being recorded.
Sorry for the interruption, Ray.
Okay.
I was just asking that, MSMEs form one of the strongest pillars of getting our economy back to growth quickly. So do you have any specific advice for MSMEs on how they want to manage their finances, or if they're looking for investments, what they ought to do?
By definition, startups are not established, by definition. And that means they are at huge risk. Now, startups in the digital field, in online communication, in payments and so on, are probably in the best place they can be. If their product is any good, it's really going to go. But startups in different areas outside of online or digital, my advice would be conserve your cash, strip away everything that isn't vital and wait until business resumes. But if it's online or digital and it's a good product or good service, then I think go for it.
I will come back with a follow-up questions, but we have another member who's asking a question. His name is R. Suresh. He's asking, by virtue of governments having to deal with this pandemic, and with the other effects of the pandemic, do you think that, governments of the future will be more effective, will be more efficient in sort of handling more, infra development of social services?
Humans are pretty incompetent in government, I'm afraid. And the more history you read, the more you realise that. And I don't think it will make governments more competent. No? I think it might make them think harder, but do humans become more capable? No. Perhaps as AI develops, and it's not going to be in the next 10 years what I'm going to talk about, but as AI really starts to become capable of being interrogated, I think we may get better advice. But that's 20 years away, 30 years away, perhaps. And I don't think, I'm afraid, I think that in general, many humans are incompetent, and that's going to remain the way governments operate.
Also have a question on the similar lines being asked by our member, Sumit Doshi, who's from Kronos. He's trying to understand, what impact will COVID-19 have on China in terms of global economics? Is China sort of going to be ostracized in some way?
We don't know. We don't know, because America now is talking about suing China for hundreds of billions of dollars because they claim that China was irresponsible. I don't think that one's going to fly. We don't know what's going to happen in China and in terms of China's relationship with the world. I mean, I've heard some ridiculous conspiracy theories that this is something that China deliberately unleashed on the world. Well, no, it didn't, because the damage to China is absolutely enormous. And what I'm sure of is that what will happen will depend upon the politics of our leaders over the next 2 years. But I've got no way of knowing.
While we have questions coming in, I wanted to ask you, a lot of experts have gone on and said, and you also said in your presentation, you mentioned black swan events, right? But with the practices in general across different continents, do you see another zoonotic virus taking such a dangerous, dangerous toll towards human life and economics, in the coming years?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand the thrust of that one.
So I was just trying to ask you, Ray, that now that we've seen a lot of zoonotic virus come into the human mainstream, do you see a possibility of another black swan event because of?
Well, I understand the question, but I don't know the answer, because by definition, black swan is black swan. And that means we cannot know. I mean, do I know whether next year an asteroid will threaten the Earth? No, I don't. Do I know whether there will be a giant volcanic eruption somewhere which will cloud the atmosphere? No, I don't. Do I know that whatever's going on in North Korea will lead to a nuclear explosion in the next few weeks? No, I don't. That's a black swan event. So you have to say nobody can think about it or predict it. You can't, other than building strong balance sheets, other than keeping good cash reserves, nobody can plan for black swan events.
Another follow-up question to the startup question that I had was, you also mentioned about how the dynamics between employees are going to sort of work out, right? We've seen specific to startups, because a lot of them are born in the cloud. Uh, they're quick to move their operations online. But do you think they're ready uh, in terms of processes to have their operations continue, or what they should look at in terms of, say, water cooler conversations, or the dynamics between employees?
I don't think that it will stay the same. I think it must change. Now, that depends whether or not employees are called back to the office and resume working as before. Now, in the hybrid social distancing scheme, they can't. Because if you call everybody back and you're still social distancing, it means that you have to clean every bathroom every time an employee uses it. It means that you have to move workstations so they're at least 2 or 3 meters apart. It means that you can't have any communal places where you get a coffee. It means you've got no water cooler operation. You can't even share elevators. So you'll understand that normal office life can't resume, really, until there are vaccines that are effective and widespread. Now, if people are allowed to work from home long term, it will definitely change the dynamic of the workplace, definitely. Now, as I said right at the beginning of my presentation, I do know that people need people. If I work with a team of people, for example, on a newspaper or in a car business, I need sometimes to talk to those people personally, directly, face to face. And although Zoom and all the others are very good for project management, that doesn't build the team. That does not allow real collaboration of thought. It doesn't really allow the proper blue sky thinking that we do when we're together. So I think we are going to see, for those who are allowed, encouraged to work at home, they'll be going to the office once a week and spending an afternoon or a morning or perhaps a whole day actually in meetings and talking and so on. But during the social distancing period, that bit may have to be on hold.
Ray, another member, Pawan Modapati, is trying to ask you, should we not have global business immunity policies in place for select countries, for the benefit of larger mass or citizens, with various support structure in place?
Should we not have what as a
global business immunity policies?
Well, I'd like to think so, but I'm not sure who's going to organise that, who's going to lead it. I'd like to think that at the end of the Second World War, the world leaders came together and they created the United Nations, which was intended to be a sort of world government until America decided pretty quickly that it didn't like the idea of another world government and it wanted to do it, so it hobbled the United Nations. The World Health Organization was supposed to be a really first-class health liaison and organizing body for the world. But in this pandemic, it has shown itself woeful. It's been really poor. And what we need, just as after the Second World War, we need new institutions, new organizations to actually manage the world. Is that going to happen? No, I don't think it is. Mainly because of the competitive nature of the superpowers.
Ray, another question is, very interesting, is will history document this whole entire pandemic outbreak as something compared to as a global World War III event?
Yes.
Hello, Ray. Sorry, I missed your answer there.
Yeah, the answer was yes. It is the equivalent to a World War III.
And then do you think that because of such a pandemic coming into the picture, do you think, global nations, superpowers will start thinking, spending, routing their, budget towards more research towards healthcare rather than on weapons or defense equipments?
Yes, they will.
I think we've come to an end of the questions from the members. Thank you, Ray, so much for presenting your ideas and your insights for the future of business after COVID-19. Thank you for
Well,
answering
thank you.
all our.
Thank you for asking. I don't have any strong answers. All I'm trying to do is to provide some tools with which we can try and think about this. What's happened to all of us is terrible. We have to do our best to get through it. And let me wish every member there, every participant, good health for themselves and their families and good fortune. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ray, again. Thank you, members, for joining in. We hope to catch you in another webinar.
Bye for now.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, Ray.
I am sorry, you are not allowed to use conference service for 1 or less participants.